There is a small valley on the border between Vermont and New York, only a few miles across, where for more than a century men made their living by splitting mountains into paper. Not literally paper, of course. Slate, roofing slate, thin, flat sheets of dark stone, and the men who made them could take a rough block of rock the size of a loaf of bread and, with a chisel and a wooden mallet and an almost unbelievable skill, split it, again and again, into smooth sheets of stone as thin as a quarter of an inch, thin enough to flex a little in the hand, each one perfect and true, ready to be nailed to a roof where it would last 100 years and more. The place is called the Slate Valley, and the roofs of a huge share of 19th century America, the churches and the courthouses and the great houses and the ordinary homes of a growing nation, were covered in stone that came out of it. And the men who did the splitting, the men with the impossible skill in their hands, were, above all, immigrants from a small, hard, rainy corner of Wales, who brought a craft their people had practiced for 500 years across an ocean to a Vermont hillside, and who paid for it, many of them, by slowly breathing the stone dust into their lungs until it killed them. This is a story about a skill so specific and so refined that it is almost impossible to believe until you see it. The splitting of solid rock into thin, flexible sheets by hand, and about the people who carried that skill from Wales to America, and about the terrible price the work extracted from their bodies. The men in this valley did not build a single famous monument. There is no Slate Valley the way there is a Brooklyn Bridge. What they made was smaller and more scattered and more humble, and in a way more intimate, because it ended up over people's heads, keeping the rain off millions of Americans for generations. And almost no one who lived under those roofs ever thought for a moment about the Welshmen in the quarry who had split the stone. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. Because the skill of the slate splitter is one of the most extraordinary and least known of all the old handcrafts, and the men who had it deserve to be remembered, let me start with the stone itself, because the whole thing depends on a strange and beautiful property of slate that most people have never thought about. Slate is a metamorphic rock, formed when ancient beds of mud and clay were buried deep in the earth and squeezed under enormous pressure for millions of years, and that pressure did something remarkable to it. It gave the rock what geologists call cleavage, a hidden grain, an internal structure of parallel planes along which the stone will split cleanly, far more easily than in any other direction. A block of good roofing slate is not uniform. It wants to split, along those planes, into flat sheets, if you know exactly how to persuade it. It is worth dwelling on how that cleavage forms, because it is a genuine wonder of geology, and it is the whole reason the industry exists. Slate begins as shale or mudstone, ordinary fine-grained sediment laid down at the bottom of ancient seas, layer on layer, over ages. Then the earth moves, and that sedimentary rock gets caught in the slow, titanic collision of continents and buried deep and squeezed under immense pressure at moderate heat, for a span of time we can barely imagine. Under that pressure, the tiny flat mineral grains in the rock all rotate and align themselves, perpendicular to the direction of the squeeze, into parallel planes, like a deck of cards all facing the same way. And it is along those aligned planes, the slaty cleavage, that the finished rock will split. Here is the strange part, the part that makes the whole industry possible. That cleavage plane is usually not the same as the original bedding, the layers in which the mud was first deposited. The pressure imposes a new grain on the rock, cutting across the old one, and it is that new, pressure-borne grain that the splitter follows. So when a Welshman in a Vermont quarry set his chisel to a block and split it clean, he was releasing a structure that had been pressed into the stone hundreds of millions of years ago by the collision of continents, reading, with his hands, a grain written into the rock by forces that raised whole mountain ranges. He did not think of it that way, of course. He thought of it as good slate or bad slate, splittable or not. But that is what he was doing, every time he tapped his mallet, feeling for a plane of weakness that the deep earth had built into the stone in an age before there were any mountains where Vermont now stands. And that is the secret at the heart of the whole industry. Slate can be split, by hand, along its natural cleavage, into thin, flat, smooth, remarkably uniform sheets. And those sheets happen to make just about the finest roofing material there is. Slate does not burn, which, in an age of wooden cities and open flames, was no small thing. It does not rot. It sheds water perfectly. And it lasts on a roof, not for years or decades, but for a century or more, often outliving the building beneath it. A well-slated roof was as close to permanent as a roof could be, and in the 19th century, as America built its cities and its towns at a furious pace, the demand for it was enormous. To understand that demand, you have to remember what roofs were like before good slate was widely available, and how much a fireproof roof was worth. For most of history, ordinary buildings were roofed with whatever was cheap and local, wooden shingles or shakes or thatch, and these materials had one catastrophic flaw. They burned. In the crowded wooden cities of the 18th and 19th centuries, a fire that started in one building could leap from wooden roof to wooden roof and consume whole districts in a night, and the great city fires of that era, which destroyed enormous swaths of places like Chicago and others, were spread in part by burning roofs. A slate roof did not burn. It was, in a real sense, a piece of fireproofing laid over a building, and as cities grew and fire codes tightened and people who could afford it looked for protection, a slate roof became not just handsome and durable, but genuinely safer, a barrier against the flames that were every city's terror. And beyond the safety, there was the sheer permanence. A wooden roof might last 20 years before it had to be redone. A slate roof, properly laid, could last 100 years or more. Longer than the mortgage, longer than the owner, a roof you put on once and never thought about again. Fireproof, waterproof, and nearly eternal, slate was the premium roof of the age, the mark of a serious, permanent, well-built structure. And every church and courthouse and bank and fine house that wanted to announce that it was built to last reached for slate. In a nation building itself at breakneck speed and terrified of fire, the appetite for it was almost bottomless, and the Slate Valley set out to feed it. It is worth knowing how that slate came to be in Vermont at all, because it is a piece of very deep history. The slate of the Slate Valley was born hundreds of millions of years ago, when the eastern edge of ancient North America collided, slowly and titanically, with other landmasses in the mountain-building events that raised the ancestral Appalachians and the Taconic Mountains of the region. Old beds of seafloor mud were caught in that collision, buried and squeezed and heated and turned to slate, with the cleavage pressed into them by the same forces that folded the mountains. Then, over the ages that followed, the mountains above wore down, and erosion eventually exposed those slate beds at the surface, tilted and folded, along that narrow band on what is now the Vermont and New York line. So the Slate Valley is, in a sense, a scar of an ancient collision of continents, laid bare by 100 million years of erosion, and the good slate lies in beds that run through it, some better and some worse, some the plain grays and blacks, and some the rare and valuable colors. The early settlers of the region noticed the stone, and by the middle of the 19th century, people had begun to understand that these beds held roofing slate as good as any in the world, if only there were men who knew how to work it. The stone had been waiting there, in the ground, since before there were mountains anywhere near where Vermont now stands, for the particular combination of a growing nation's hunger for roofs and a wave of skilled immigrants who knew the ancient craft. When those two things arrived together, in the 1850s, the Slate Valley was born, out of a collision that had happened before the age of the dinosaurs. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. But cleavage or no cleavage, splitting a rock into perfect thin sheets, is not something an untrained person can do. It is a genuine craft, one of the most refined hand skills in all of industry, learned over years, and the people who had brought that craft to its highest pitch were the Welsh. In the mountains of North Wales, people had been quarrying and splitting slate since the Middle Ages, since around the year 1399 by some reckonings. And over those centuries they had built a whole culture and a whole body of skill around the working of slate. The great Welsh quarries became, in time, the center of the world's slate industry, enormous operations carved into the mountainsides. And the Welsh quarrymen were the acknowledged masters of the craft Men who understood slate in their hands and their bones in a way no one else did. The Welsh slate industry was, in its heyday, one of the wonders of the industrial world, and it is worth seeing it to understand what the immigrants carried with them. In the mountains of North Wales, the great quarries grew into staggering places, whole mountainsides carved away into vast stepped terraces, descending hundreds of feet, worked by thousands of men, producing slate that roofed not just Britain but much of the world. These were among the largest slate quarries on Earth, and the towns around them were built entirely on slate. Their chapels and their libraries, and their fierce culture of self-education and song, all resting on the labor of the quarrymen. And the Welsh quarrymen were proud, skilled, literate, and organized, with a strong sense of the dignity and the danger of their craft. They had a whole vocabulary for the work, whole traditions of how a gang was formed and paid, a culture of the quarry that had grown up over centuries. They knew slate as few people on Earth did, from the reading of the rock in the quarry face to the final tap that freed a perfect roofing slate. When these men, or men trained in that tradition, crossed the ocean to Vermont, they did not just bring strong arms. They brought all of that, the deep knowledge, the specific skills, the culture, and the pride, and the songs, the entire accumulated inheritance of 500 years of a people working stone. That is what was transplanted to the Slate Valley. Not just labor, but a craft tradition, among the oldest and most refined in the industrial world, carried in the hands and the heads of immigrants, and set down, whole, on an American hillside, where it would produce the roofs of a new nation. It is one of the clearest examples I know of how the skills that built America came from somewhere, were carried here by particular people, from particular places, and did not spring up out of the ground. The stone was American, the skill was Welsh, and old, and hard-won, and it came in on the immigrant ships. And when America, in the middle of the 19th century, discovered that it too had good slate in the ground, in that valley on the Vermont and New York line, and in a few other places, it needed men who knew how to work it. And so it turned to Wales. Now let me bring in the men, because this is where it becomes a human story of migration and skill. Beginning around 1850, Welsh slate workers started arriving in the Slate Valley, drawn across the ocean by the promise of work, in a place that had the stone, but not the skill. The first Welsh immigrants reached the town of Fair Haven in Vermont around 1850, and within a couple of years, groups of Welsh settlers were arriving in the New York towns just across the line as well, and the trickle became a stream. These were not unskilled laborers coming for any work they could find. They were craftsmen, carriers of a 500-year tradition, and they brought that tradition with them and planted it in the Vermont hills. As the industry boomed later in the century, the operators went straight back to the source and recruited more, bringing over hundreds of experienced Welsh quarrymen at a time to feed the growing demand. The Slate Valley became, in a real sense, a piece of Wales transplanted to America, with Welsh chapels and the Welsh language and Welsh singing, and above all the Welsh craft of the slate splitter, carried across the Atlantic and set to work on American stone. And Welsh, though the core of it was, the valley eventually drew workers from all over, from Poland and Italy and Ireland and Hungary and beyond, as the industry hungered for hands, so that the quarries became a mixing of peoples, but the craft at the center of it, the splitting, remained the Welsh inheritance. I want to say a word about why they came, because it was not simply adventure. Wales in the 19th century was a hard place for a working man. The quarries owned by a handful of great landlords, the work dangerous, and the pay low, and the relationship between the quarrymen and the owners often bitter, breaking out at times into long and painful strikes and lockouts that could starve a quarry town. For a skilled Welsh slate worker, the news that America had slate and wanted men who could work it, at better wages, and with the chance of something more like independence, was a powerful pull. So they came, individually and in groups, and later, in organized parties, recruited directly by the American operators, who knew exactly what they were buying and went to Wales to get it. They crossed the ocean, and they made their way to the Vermont and New York line, and they set up their lives in the new valley, and they wrote home, and more came. Whole families, whole chapel congregations, whole networks of kin and neighbors followed the slate from one country to the other, and they recreated, as immigrants do, as much of home as they could, the chapel and the language and the singing especially, because the Welsh were famous for their singing and brought it with them. For a time, In those Vermont towns, you could hear Welsh spoken in the street, and Welsh hymns sung on Sunday. A small piece of North Wales set down among the American hills, held together by the stone and the craft that had brought them all across the sea. It is a classic American immigrant story, and it deserves to be told as one. But with this particular twist, that what these immigrants brought was not just their labor, but a specific, ancient, irreplaceable skill, without which the American stone would have stayed in the ground. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Because now I want to take you into the quarry and show you exactly how a mountain became a roof, one split at a time. It began in the quarry, and the quarries of the Slate Valley were deep, dramatic places, great pits dug down into the slate beds, growing deeper and more sheer as the years passed and the stone was taken out, until men were working at the bottom of pits hundreds of feet deep, hauling the blocks up to the surface. Getting the slate out of the ground was heavy, dangerous work. Men called rockmen would drill and blast the solid slate to break large blocks free from the beds, using black powder carefully, because too heavy a charge would shatter the slate and ruin its cleavage, and the rough blocks were then hoisted out of the pit and taken to be worked. Those quarries deserve a closer look, because they were dramatic and dangerous places. A slate quarry was not a mine with tunnels, for the most part, but an open pit, dug straight down into the slate beds and growing steadily deeper as the good stone was removed, so that over the decades a working quarry could become a vast, sheer-walled hole in the ground, hundreds of feet deep, with the men and the stone at the bottom of it. To get the great blocks of slate up out of that pit, the quarries used derricks, tall masts with long booms, powered at first by hand and horse, and later by steam and cable, swinging the heavy blocks up out of the depths to the working sheds at the surface. The rockmen down in the pit had the job of freeing the blocks from the beds, and this was where the black powder came in, and it required a delicate touch, because slate is valuable precisely for its ability to split cleanly, and a blast that was too heavy would shatter that quality and turn good roofing slate into worthless rubble. So the rockmen had to break the stone free with just enough force and no more, reading the natural joints and seams in the rock to get the blocks out whole and sound. And all of it happened at the bottom of a deep and dangerous pit, with heavy blocks swinging overhead on the derrick cables, with the ever-present risk of a fall from the quarry edge, of a rock coming loose from the wall, of a cable or a derrick failing, of a blast going wrong. Men were killed in the quarries, by falls and by falling stone, and by the machinery and the powder, the ordinary steady toll of heavy industrial labor done in a hazardous place. The quarry was where the mountain was opened and the stone was won, by hard and dangerous work, and it was only the first stage. The blocks that came up out of the pit were still just rough rock. The transformation into something delicate and precise and valuable happened up in the sheds, at the hands of the splitter. The quarrying itself carried the ordinary deadly hazards of all such work. Falling rock, blasting accidents, men and equipment plunging into the deep pits, the constant danger of moving heavy stone. But the quarrying was only the beginning. The real magic, the thing that turned a block of rock into a roof, happened next, and it was done by the splitter. The splitter is the man at the center of this whole story, and his skill is worth trying to picture in detail, because it is genuinely astonishing. He would take one of the rough blocks and, first, saw or split it into smaller pieces of a workable size. Then, sitting with a block held against him or on his knee, he would take a broad chisel and set its edge against the edge of the block, exactly along the line of the cleavage, and give it a precise tap with a wooden mallet. And if he had judged it right, and his hands knew the stone, the block would split, cleanly, down its whole length, into two thinner pieces. Then he would take each of those and split them again, and again, and again, each sheet thinner than the last, halving and halving the stone, feeling his way along the invisible planes of cleavage, until from a single block he had produced a stack of thin, flat, smooth slates, each one a fraction of an inch thick, each one strong and true. To split a piece of stone so thin that it will flex without shattering it, over and over, dozens of times from a single block, judging by feel and by eye and by the sound of the tap exactly where the stone will part, is a skill that takes years to learn and a lifetime to master, and the good splitters were craftsmen of the highest order. Beside the splitter often worked a dresser, who took the split sheets and trimmed them to their final size and shape, squaring the edges, cutting the nail holes, turning the rough split slates into the neat, uniform roofing slates that would go out to the builders. The dresser's craft deserves its own moment, because trimming a split slate to its finished form was a skill in itself. Traditionally, the dresser used a tool, something like a broad blade set into a bench, to trim the rough edges of the split sheet, chopping the slate cleanly to a straight edge, squaring the corners, and cutting it to the standard sizes the trade demanded, because roofing slates came in specific dimensions that a roofer could lay in overlapping courses, and he punched or drilled the holes through which the slate would be nailed to the roof. All of it had to be done without cracking the thin, brittle sheet, a matter of knowing exactly how the stone would behave under the blade. Between the splitter and the dresser, a rough block of quarried rock became a stack of finished roofing slates, uniform, sized, holed, and ready to ship. And the two skills together, the splitting and the dressing, were the heart of the whole industry. And notice that almost none of it was mechanized. For the whole peak of the industry, through the 1800s and beyond, the splitting especially resisted every attempt at a machine, because no machine could feel the cleavage the way a man's hands could judge by the sound and the feel exactly where and how hard to tap. The splitting stayed a handcraft long after so much else had been given over to machines, precisely because it was a kind of knowledge that lived in the body and could not be reduced to gears. That is part of what makes these men worth remembering. They were not tenders of machines. They were the machine, the irreplaceable human instrument, and the quality of every slate depended entirely on the skill in a particular pair of hands. A great splitter was a craftsman in the fullest and oldest sense of the word, and the roofs of America rode on his judgment, tap by tap, sheet by sheet. A gang of a few men, the rockmen and the splitter and the dresser, working together, could turn the raw beds of the earth into finished roofing, and the heart of it, the irreplaceable skill, was in the splitter's hands and the single tap of his mallet. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. But there was a price for all of this, and the men paid it in their lungs, and it is one of the cruelest parts of the story. Working slate, splitting it, and especially trimming and dressing and later sawing it, produced fine dust, tiny sharp particles of stone that hung in the air of the quarries and the sheds where the men worked. And the men breathed it all day, every day, for years. And that dust, drawn deep into the lungs, did not come back out. It lodged there, and it scarred the lung tissue. Slowly, particle by particle, year by year, until a man's lungs no longer worked as they should, and he began to struggle for breath, and the struggle grew worse, and in the end, many of them died of it. The disease is called silicosis, the stonecutter's disease, the quarryman's disease, and it was the shadow that lay over the whole slate industry, in Wales and in Vermont alike. A man could survive every falling rock, and every blasting accident, and every plunge into the deep pit, could master the beautiful craft of the split, and practice it for decades, and still be killed by it in the end. Slowly, by the very stone he had spent his life shaping, breathed in, a little at a time, until it filled his lungs. The death rate among the slate workers ran high, higher in some measures than among coal miners, and a great many of the men who split the stone that roofed America died young and hard, gasping, of the dust of their own craft. I do not want to move past that too quickly, because the silicosis is, in a way, the moral center of this whole story, the price written into the craft itself. Understand that the dust was not an accident, or the failure of one bad quarry. It was inherent in the work. Every time a slate was trimmed, dressed, or sawn, the stone gave off fine particles, and the men who did that work, day in and day out, in the sheds, could not avoid breathing it. In the early days, no one understood how deadly it was, and even once it was understood, the protections came slowly and imperfectly, and the dust went on filling the men's lungs. And silicosis is a cruel disease, because it is slow. A young man could work for years feeling fine, the damage accumulating invisibly, and then, in his 30s or 40s, begin to notice that he could not catch his breath the way he used to, that a flight of stairs left him gasping. And it would only get worse, the scarring in his lungs spreading, until a man who had been strong enough to split stone all day could not walk across a room without stopping to breathe, and then could not breathe at all. It killed men in the prime of their lives, slowly, over years, and it killed a great many of them, so that the Slate towns knew the sight of the gasping men, the retired quarrymen sitting on their porches, fighting for air, dying by inches of the trade that had fed their families. It was, in the coldest terms, an occupational disease with a very high toll, and in human terms it was a slow sentence of death handed to men simply for practicing their craft. The roofs of America were bought, in part, with the lungs of the men who split the slate, and that is not a metaphor. It is a plain description of what happened. And here is where I want to pause on the strangeness and the injustice of it, because it is so characteristic of all these stories. Think about what these men did. They took a mountain and turned it, by hand, with a skill 5 centuries in the making, into millions of perfect roofing slates. And those slates went out and covered the roofs of a growing nation. And they are still up there, many of them, right now, keeping the rain off houses and churches and public buildings 150 years later, an almost invisible layer of Welsh craftsmanship spread across the whole country. And the men who made them, the splitters with the miraculous hands, got a hard life in a deep pit, a lungful of killing dust, and an early grave, and then were forgotten entirely because a roof is not a thing anyone looks at or thinks about, and a slate is not signed. And the man who split it left no name on it, only his skill, invisible, in the perfect thinness and trueness of the stone. Every one of those old slate roofs is a monument to a forgotten craftsman, and no one ever reads it, because no one ever looks up at a roof and wonders whose hands made the stone that has kept them dry for a century. And the reach of it, when you start to look, is astonishing. Once you know what slate is and where it came from, you begin to see it everywhere in the older parts of the country, on the churches with their steep dark roofs, on the old courthouses and city halls, on the fine Victorian houses with their patterned roofs, because one of the beautiful things about the Slate Valley was that Vermont produces slate in colors that most of the world's slate does not. Most slate is gray or black, but the Vermont beds yield greens and purples and deep reds and mottled variegated slates, and the roofers of the 19th century used these colored slates to lay patterns, bands and diamonds and designs across the great roofs of the era, so that a fine slate roof was not just protection but ornament, a work of art in stone laid over a building. Those patterned colored roofs, many of them still up there, are Slate Valley slate, split and dressed by the Welsh and their fellow workers and shipped out across the country. And beyond the grand buildings, ordinary homes by the hundreds of thousands wore plain slate roofs, humble and durable, keeping the weather off generations of families. The stone from that one small valley spread out across the whole nation and settled onto its rooftops, and a great deal of it is still there, still working, a century and a half later. When you drive through an old American town and look up at the dark, still sound roofs of its oldest and finest buildings, you are very often looking at the work of the Slate Valley, at stone, that a Welsh immigrant split by hand from a Vermont mountain, and that has outlasted him, and his children, and their children, and is still doing its quiet job over the heads of people who have no idea it is anything but a roof. Getting all that slate from the Vermont hills onto the roofs of the whole country was its own considerable enterprise, and it is worth a moment. Slate is heavy, and a roof's worth of it is a serious tonnage. So the industry depended entirely on cheap transport to reach its markets, and it grew up alongside the railroads that spread across the region in the same decades. The finished slates were packed and loaded and shipped out by rail to the cities and towns of the East and the Midwest and beyond, and the reach of a quarry was set by how far its slate could be carried before the freight cost ate the profit. Around the quarries grew a whole commercial world. The operators who owned or leased the beds and hired the gangs, the dealers who bought and sold the slate, the men who ran the sheds and kept the books, the teamsters and the railroad men who moved it. The little towns of the Slate Valley, Pulteney and Fairhaven and Granville and the rest became busy industrial centers, their fortunes rising and falling with the slate market, boom and slump, as the demand for roofs surged and fell with the building cycles of the growing nation. It was a real industry, not a quaint craft in isolation, but a significant piece of the American economy, employing thousands, feeding families, filling rail cars, and roofing a nation, all of it resting, at its base, on the skill of the splitter and the labor of the men in the deep pits. The slate that a Welshman split in a Vermont shed might be on a train the next week and on a church roof in a distant city the month after, and the whole apparatus of the modern economy, the railroads and the dealers and the markets, existed to carry his handiwork out into the country and up onto the roofs where it would quietly outlast everyone involved. At its height, around the turn of the 20th century, the scale of it was genuinely impressive. There were something like 250 quarries operating in the Slate Valley, and close to 1,000 workers laboring in them, a whole dense industrial district carved into that narrow band of hills on the state line, humming with the work of getting the stone out, and splitting it, and shipping it. Picture that, 250 separate quarries, deep pits with their derricks swinging, and around them the splitting sheds ringing with the tap of 1,000 mallets, and the rail cars loading, and the towns full of Welsh and Polish and Italian and Irish families all living off the stone. For a few decades, that one little valley was among the great slate-producing regions in the world, pouring out roofing by the trainload, and it was all built on the craft that the Welsh had carried across the sea and taught to everyone who came after. It did not stay at that height, but for a while it was a real and roaring industry, and the roofs it produced in those peak years are a great many of the old slate roofs still standing across the country today. The industry did not last at its full height, of course, because the same forces that ended so many of these crafts came for slate too. In the 20th century, cheaper roofing materials arrived, above all the asphalt shingle. Mass-produced and quick to lay and far cheaper than hand-split slate, and the great demand that had built the Slate Valley slowly fell away. The number of quarries shrank, and the number of workers with it, and the boom that had brought hundreds of Welshmen across the ocean faded into a much smaller, quieter industry. But, and this is one of the few happy notes in these stories, it did not die completely. The Slate Valley is still there, and slate is still quarried and split there today on a far smaller scale than in its heyday, but genuinely, by people who still know the craft, some of them descendants of the Welsh who brought it. Vermont slate, in its distinctive colors, the greens and the purples and the reds that the Vermont beds produce, unusual in the slate world, is still prized and still made. And a good slate roof is still one of the finest and most permanent a building can have. The skill did not entirely vanish. It thinned and it shrank, but a thread of it survives, in the same valley, split by hand in the same way, a living remnant of the 500-year craft the Welsh carried across the sea. There is something worth honoring in that survival, small as it is. So many of the crafts and industries in these stories vanished utterly. The steam donkey, the plank road, the great old-growth forest, gone entirely, surviving only in photographs and memory. The slate craft did not entirely go. It contracted, hard, as the cheap asphalt shingle took over the ordinary roofing market, and the Slate Valley is a much quieter place than it was in its roaring peak of hundreds of quarries and 1,000 men. But because there is still a market for the very best, for the roof that will last a century, for the beautiful colored Vermont slate, for the historic restoration and the fine new building, a real slate industry survives in that valley to this day. Still quarrying, still splitting the stone by hand in essentially the way the Welsh taught, still carried on in part by the descendants of those first immigrants. It is one of the few places in these stories where the thread was not cut, where the craft passed down, hand to hand, generation to generation, and is still alive. You can go there, to the Vermont and New York line, and find working quarries and men who still know how to set a chisel to a block and split it true, and a museum that keeps the history and the colored roofs on the buildings all around, and the whole living memory of a craft that came from Wales and put down roots and refused quite to die. That continuity is rare and precious, and I think it is worth celebrating. That in this one case, the skill did not slip entirely into the past, but held on, thinner but unbroken, into the present. And I want to say something about the community those men built, because it was remarkable and it is part of what deserves to be remembered. The Welsh who came to the Slate Valley did not just work. They built a whole life, and it carried the distinctive stamp of their culture. They were famously devout and famously musical, and they built their chapels and filled them, and they sang, in the great Welsh tradition of choral singing that they had brought across the sea so that the slate towns rang with Welsh hymns. They held Eisteddfodau, the traditional Welsh festivals of music and poetry and competition on American soil, keeping the old culture alive in the new country. They prized learning and self-improvement, as the Welsh quarry towns of the old country had. And they carried, too, the Welsh tradition of the dignity and the solidarity of the working man, so that the Slate Valley, like the Welsh quarries before it, saw its share of labor struggle, of strikes and disputes between the men who split the stone and the operators who profited from it. These were not passive or broken people. They were a proud, cultured, organized community of skilled craftsmen who happened to make their living breathing stone dust at the bottom of deep pits, and who built, in the Vermont hills, a genuine and vivid piece of Welsh American life. That community faded as the industry shrank and the generations passed and the descendants assimilated, but its traces are still there, in the chapels and the family names and the museum and the surviving craft, a reminder that the roofs of America were made not by an anonymous mass of labor, but by a specific people, with a specific and rich culture, who came from a specific and distant place, and who deserved to be remembered as who they were. It is worth understanding, too, that this skill was not something a man could simply pick up. It had to be learned, slowly, over years, and the learning of it is part of what bound the community together. A boy or a young man would come into the trade as a helper, assisting an established gang, watching and carrying and gradually being allowed to try. Learning by long apprenticeship the feel of the stone, the read of the cleavage, the exact judgment of the tap from the older men who already had it. You could not learn to split slate from a book or in a day. You learned it from a master, over years, hands on the stone, until the knowledge migrated from his hands into yours, and one day you could feel the cleavage yourself and split a block clean. That is why the skill traveled the way it did in people, from Wales to Vermont, from father to son, from old hand to young. A living chain of knowledge passed body to body down the generations. Break that chain, lose the old men before they can teach the young, and the skill is simply gone, because it exists nowhere but in trained human hands. That the chain held, in the Slate Valley, thin but unbroken, from the first Welsh immigrants, right down to the men splitting slate there today, is one of the quietly remarkable things in this whole history, a 500-year-old skill still being passed, hand to hand, in a Vermont shed. When I think about the Slate Valley now, I think about the quiet, invisible reach of what those men did. They did not build one great thing that everyone knows. They made a small thing, a roofing slate, and they made it by the millions, and it spread out across the country and up onto the roofs and disappeared from thought, doing its humble, essential job in silence for lifetimes. There is something moving to me in that particular kind of forgotten labor, the labor that ends up not in a monument, but in the ordinary fabric of everyday life, in the roof over a stranger's head a state away, and a century later. The Welshman who split that slate is long dead, of the dust most likely, and his name is gone, and the family in the house below has no idea he ever existed. But his work is still up there, still shedding the rain, still doing exactly what he made it to do, 100 and more years after his hands let it go. That is a strange kind of immortality, humble and hidden and real. And I think the least we can do, we who have lived our whole lives under roofs that men like him made possible, is to look up once and know that the stone up there was split from a mountain by hand, by a craftsman who breathed his own early death to make it, and who deserves at the very least to be remembered by someone. I think about the quiet asymmetry of it a great deal. A man breathes stone dust for 30 years and dies gasping, and the roof he made outlives him by a century. And the two facts sit there together, the short broken life and the long enduring work, and almost no one ever connects them. The slate does not know what it cost. The family under it does not know. The nation that was roofed by these men has almost entirely forgotten that the craft existed, that it came from Wales, that men died of it, that a whole community lived and sang and struggled and coughed out its lungs to produce the humble gray and green and purple stone up there over everyone's heads. And yet the work remains, honest and useful and beautiful, doing exactly what it was made to do, long after the maker is dust himself. There is a kind of faithfulness in a slate roof, a keeping of a promise made by a dead man's hands, and I find I cannot look at one now, on an old church or a fine old house, without thinking of the splitter in the shed, the tap of the mallet, the invisible grain in the stone, the dust in the air, the whole vanished world of skill and suffering that put that stone up there and asked nothing in return but a wage, and got, in the end, an early grave, and a forgetting. To remember them, even a little, even just to know that they were there when we look up at a roof, is a small justice. It is most of what I have to offer them. And I think for a craft this beautiful and a price this high, it is the very least that they are owed. So the next time you pass an old church or an old courthouse or a fine old house, and you happen to notice the roof, dark and steep and still perfectly sound after 150 years, look at it for a second longer than you normally would. That is not just a roof. That is a mountain split into thin sheets by hand by a man from Wales who is very likely long dead of the dust, carried across an ocean and up onto that gable to keep the rain off strangers for a century after he was gone. He never signed it. He was never thanked for it. But it is still there, still working, still in a way his, and now, at least, you know. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.